Hello, and welcome to today's Trainer Education webinar, Thriving Through Change, hosted by HRDQ and presented by Dr. Cynthia Scott. Today's webinar will last approximately an hour. Before we begin, note that there is either labeled a question or it might say chat box, usually it's on your upper right-hand corner of the screen. There you can submit any questions that you have, and then we'll either answer those as your questions come in during the Q&A session with Cynthia at the end of the presentation or afterwards by email. My name is Sarah Montgomery, and I will moderate today's webinar. I'm in business development for HRDQ, a publisher of research-based training solutions that improve the performance of individuals, teams, and organizations. Today's presenter is Dr. Cynthia Scott. She is a founding principal of ChangeWorks Global and is a recognized leader with over 25 years of experience in the fields of strategic navigation of continual organizational change and the sustainable leadership. She is a core faculty member at the Presidio Graduate School MBA and Executive Certificate Program in Sustainable Leadership. Cynthia is the author of numerous books, including Rekindling Commitment and Take This Work and Love It. And her work has been featured in publications such as the Wall Street Journal, Business Week, the Stanford Business School Newsletter, and Worthwhile Magazine. Some of her clients include Blue Shield of California, Charles Schwab, Kaiser Permanente, AT&T, and Estee Lauder. Cynthia is also the author of the assessment Mastering the Change Curve. We are so pleased to have Cynthia share her expertise in organizational change with us today. Welcome, and thank you for joining us, Cynthia.
Thank you, Sarah. I am very glad to be here with you, and special thanks to HRDQ for offering to put this all together with me. And to the people online, we understand we have people all over the world. There's even someone here from Egypt. I'm very excited to share the results of our work with over 200 organizations to help you increase your own change mastery. So to get us started, let's start with a poll. And I'm going to launch the poll. Here we go. And what we're going to ask you to do is to indicate which of these choices that you are experiencing with approaching change. Now, I know some of these. This will be an easy thing to get started on, and it looks like people are voting in right now. I'm looking at the results coming in. And I like that we are having a broad range of responses, because we're going to use this as a way of setting up what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to close the poll because we've got about 82% of the people have responded right now. And looking at the responses, it's very interesting. I really see a pattern, and I think we're going to look at the pattern, that 60% are very excited about the possibilities. 21% say they like to master things quickly and get things done. 15% have got the snorkel on and are just trying to get through what's going on. And 5% are still feeling kind of grumpy. Now, let's remember that you are a selective audience, and you're here as learners and probably change initiators. It would be curious to know, what would it look like in your organization? How many people would be in the different categories? So what I've done today is really prepare our presentation so that you can, I'm going to the next. So that we can really take care of some of those questions. I'm going to do 4 things. I'm going to tell you how the brain responds to change. I've kind of added a new piece on neuro leadership because I find that there's some new research that really helps this go better. And I'm going to help you identify a predictable path so you can navigate both yourself and your teams and organizations. I'm going to help you with leading teams and people through change. And we're going to learn 4 ways that you can keep yourself and your organization more resilient. So let's go to the first part. and understand how the brain responds to change. And I said I've added this because I find that there's some new research that is just very important to take a look at. And some simple truths that are, are very important. Basically, change is painful. It hurts your brain. Your brain doesn't like to change because it's breaking patterns. It's disrupting the way that you've learned how to do things. And the basics of thriving is understanding how to harness this. And especially, actually Sarah and I were talking about sustainability. It's like we are going to be provoking people big time with the changes that are going to need to happen in order for us to have a sustainable future. And leaders need to understand how to do this to foster innovation and business agility. So let's start out. Imagine this. Imagine I just walked into your training room or into your office and said, okay, everybody stand up, change seats, take everything with you, go now. I've actually done this in my executive certificate program. So basically I'm doing it with no context. I'm making it a top-down conversation. I didn't give you a reason behind this request. And what that's doing is basically provoking you. I'm doing it on purpose. Now, let's imagine if I did this not just about changing seats. What if I said you're going to change jobs? What if I said you're going to change your commute? What if I said you're going to change your community? So what I'm doing is basically provoking your lizard brain. And the lizard brain is a very old part of your brain. It's the part that basically is built to maintain you at a physiological autonomic level. Your lizard brain hates change. And it's basically the part of the brainstem that is responsible for fear, rage, the old fight or flight, and reproductive drive. So basically in answering the question, you know, why did the chicken cross the road? Because her lizard brain told her to. Your lizard brain is not going away. And all of us who are into provoking change with individuals, with groups, with whole organizations, we've got to understand how to quiet this and not ignore it. So let me talk about the three parts of the brain, and this is very simplistic. I just want you to understand that the brain is made up of lots of different elements. And basically, you've got your brain stem, which is a very old part of the brain that has to do with autonomic things like breathing. You don't have to think every moment, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. Your brain, in that deepest part, is taking care of that. You've also got the basal ganglia, which is the place where deep patterns are stored. Now, when I was teaching my son to drive stick shift, and it was a lot of grinding of the gears because he did not yet have that pattern. But you all know that if you've had that pattern or driving on one side of the road or the other side of the road, you've got that pattern deeply embedded. So that's what happens in the brainstem and the basal ganglia. The next part of your brain is that limbic system, and that's where the feeling and emotions. That's where when things happen to you, you create memories, and things get hardwired. So that's another deep part of the brain. And when it's aroused, and we'll talk about this next, you sometimes can't control it. And some people call it the amygdala hijack. Then we've got the prefrontal cortex, which is that part of our brain where working memory resides. And it's the part where we use to hold our attention, to figure out things, to compare things, to basically think. So we've got these three parts of our brain going. And one of the things that has been found in the research, and again, having been in the change field for a long time, there's been a number of different approaches. Basically, David Rock, in his book, The Brain at Work, basically throws out two approaches that people have tried. One is that incentives and threats don't make people change. They may make people comply but they don't make people committed over the long run. So you can set up people and you'll be curious to know, why do they go back? It's because behaviorism doesn't work. The second thing is kind of the humanistic, empathetic kind of, oh, this is hard, I know it's hard kind of approach. That doesn't work either because it sounds to the brain like persuasion, and the brain pushes back against it. It thinks it's a threat. So what the brain wants is to be able to make sense of the change and kind of sort through and kind of stir up a lot of connections and patterns, and then something clicks. So that's what the brain wants. Meanwhile, let's talk a little bit more about the lizard. And we talked a little bit about the emotional part of the brain, that part about threat and kind of threat and reward. And what happens in the lizard part of the brain is it has hot spots. And if you had, like, if you were bit by a dog when you were young, then you have, you know, every time you see a dog now, even though you're, 30 years older, there's a little part of your lizard brain that says, watch out, that's a dog, watch out. So what happens is when you arouse this old lizard brain, it's hard to think. It's hard to think. And it's, it basically, the way, and we'll talk more about this, but the heads up is the way to decode and comfort the lizard brain is to have it name what's going on. Say something like, oh, that's my fear of dogs, or I don't have to be afraid of dogs. So basically what it's doing is taking it from the limbic part of your brain and putting it up in the prefrontal cortex. And we'll show you how to use this in terms of application to change. Let's have another pop quiz. And I haven't talked about this yet, but let's just guess. And I'm going to launch this one. Let me go, launch. Hang on. I love this part. Okay. Let's see, Sarah. I'm trying to launch. There I am. Thank you. Did you launch it? Good. Okay. So let's answer the question. How much of your brain processing is unconscious? It looks like people are thinking about this carefully. This may disturb some of your ideas about how your brain works.
Cynthia, I see that we have a typo there on that one slide. Answer C should read 90%. So if your answer was 90%, put it in as answer C, and then Cynthia will know which answer is yours.
Great. Thank you, thank you. This is just to keep your brain awake. This is to keep you thinking of all the fine points of this. Okay, it looks like we've got about 80% of people have voted now. So let's close down the polls. And basically, those of you who guessed the 90% are correct. And it's very interesting because why not 50%? Why not 30%? Why not all of it? I mean, we would be in a different way of working if we thought all of our brain, all of our thoughts were unconscious. So let's talk a little bit about quieting the lizard brain, and then I want to give you a model to help you remember about this, because basically when you work with change, people are perceiving very quickly, 90%, very fast, whether it's dangerous or rewarding at an unconscious level. And what happens is that that limbic system gets to the conclusion faster than your prefrontal cortex can catch up. So what you're wanting to do, and understand that this is very important here, this last point about the brain circuitry gets activated by social threat as much as physical threat. And it's basically stronger and more intense and remembered. So we're going to talk about social threat. So basically, when we're dealing with change, we want to avoid waking up the lizard in people. So let's go to the next model, and this is a model that I've taken from David Rock, so I want to give him full credit for his article in Strategy and Business. And basically what he's talking about is in the circle in the center are the things that are socially threatening. We talked about, you know, if you're taking away someone's toy, that's physically threatening, or moving someone's desk. But this is actually the things that socially threaten people. And these SCARF elements are what trigger threat and reward in the workplace. So when you change people's status, I had a change going on where they moved people's desks around and gave them smaller desks and changed their title at the same time. So you're working at status, you're working at certainty, meaning I thought I had this role, now I don't have this role. The autonomy is having to do with not being able to make a choice about it, having a top-down or a fait accompli kind of saying we're not going to have this category anymore. The relatedness is where people are moved in their pattern of who they relate to and how people see them. And then the fairness stuff is very interesting. I've had some experiences. People will do things if they believe it is fair. So even if you say we're going to move to this new building, you all figure out your desks, that is perceived as more fair because there's open dialogue can happen. So what I want to do in closing up this part about the brain is to help you remember that when you are threatening the brain with change, you have to balance out one area with another. So for example, if you're going to move someone's desk, let them go to the catalog and choose which of 4 desks they want to have rather than saying this is your desk. And the other thing is you can always buffer it. We'll talk more about how to buffer people's experience. So let's go to the next piece and talk about looking at a predictable path, because one of the things I find that helps people when they're both creating change or experiencing change is understanding what are the predictable steps that are going to happen. And let's go to the next one. I'd like all of you to think of a personal experience of change that you have gone through. Now, I'm not going to ask you to share this with anybody, so you can think of a real one. And I know you have lots of them, and so just choose one, and I'd like to ask you to jot down your thoughts, feelings, and actions. And I'm going to call out 4 different stages in the change process and ask you to just kind of take some notes. So the first question I'm going to ask you is, what were your thoughts, feelings, and actions before the change happened? Back when you didn't even know the change was going on, or it was just a tiny little idea in your mind? What were some of the thoughts, feelings, and actions that you experienced? This is not the essay exam. You don't have to write down lots of things, just 1 or 2 words. Now, fast forward or flip ahead in your experience to when the change was just starting to happen, but it was really happening. And again, for some of you, it was either the change you wanted or the change you didn't want. And what were your thoughts, feelings, and actions during that time? And now allow yourself to fast forward to the time when you were 51% way through the change. Now, some of you will say, I don't know exactly when that was, but it's more than halfway. You're a little bit more on the completing the change. What were some of the thoughts, feelings, and actions that you were experiencing? And now allow yourself to remember when it was all over, when the change was done. And again, it may be the change that you wanted, the change you didn't want, but what was it like to know it was over? What were some of the thoughts, feelings, and actions that you experienced? Alrighty. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to use this now, but I have one question to kind of set us up for the debriefing of this. And it's a very quick poll. Good, thank you. Was this a change that you started, or was it a change that happened to you? And again, I know you had a lot of them to choose from. So I know you've got examples of both, but it's important that we understand this because it makes a difference in how we set up the model that's coming up. Okay? So it looks like we've got about 80% of the people have weighed in. Good voting. It looks like the majority of you were thinking about a change that happened to you. And this is important because often in organizations, it's the leaders who start the change, and they don't understand what's going on with people and why they're having kind of this scarf attack. So what I'm going to do is ask you for some of the words, and we're going to ask you to put them in the chat box. Just type in one or two words of what were some of your thoughts, feelings, or actions you experienced before the change happened. So let's ask you to type those into the chat box. I'm going to open up the chat box so I can see. Are people able to find their way to the chat box? Just some words that summarize your thoughts, feelings, or actions. So Sarah, I'm wondering if people are finding their way to the chat box.
They are, and they're coming in. What you want to open, Cynthia, is your questions. For you as an organizer, you have two options.
Thank you. Thank you.
Minimize your chat and look at your questions. There's a lot coming in. We're getting a great response.
Great. I've got it. Wonderful. I see them. Very, very good. And you'll notice how different they are. They are either kind of on the threat side or the reward side, on the, joy, happiness, all those kinds of things. Let's do the same thing for the second area of change, when it was actually happening, when it was actually going on. Let's switch the chat box to when the change was really happening, thoughts, feelings, or actions. Okay?
And Cynthia, go ahead and call some of those out to people,
right.
They won't see what other people respond.
Okay. Good. Stressed, exploring, planning, details. Some people are still happy, excited, frustrated, stressed. Lots of questions, confusion, fear, angry, overwhelmed, this is too much, excited, overwhelmed again, optimistic. So you see we're still having that broad range of variation, partly because some of you thought of a change that you initiated, and some of you thought of a change that kind of happened to you. Okay, good. Preparing, planning. Let's pause right now and let's see what your experience is as you go to the part of the stage of the change when it's over 51% of the way there. You're not in the early stages, but you're starting to kind of get a feeling of what's going on. So I see people are still resenting, accepting, inspired, frustrated, joyful, comfortable, angry, confident, some clarity, some optimism, frustrated. Okay, looking forward to things, still confused, still questioning, still overworked, still feeling stupid, very, very common, just trying to stay afloat, despair and proud. Okay, let's pause that and let's go to the end. Let's go to what are some of the words that describe how it felt, your thoughts, your feelings, your actions at the end. Yeah, we've got relief, pleasure, some loss, which is predictable, relief in capital letters, relief in small letters, reflective, apathetic, excited, content, comfortable again, happy, lost, relieved. not sure they want to do it again, I cannot do this, the fears, engaged. So again, we're still seeing a broad range of responses. Let me take you to let me tell you where this model came from and where the model in the Mastering Change Curve piece that we did for HRDQ came from. It actually began by getting a call from AT&T, which was a large organization, and they called us on our little phone in our small consulting firm and said, hey, we've heard that you guys know how to deal with change. We're doing a divestiture. We're doing a big reorganization. We're going to spin off whole business units. Can you help us? And at that point, we were just revising our model and wanting a place to test it, so it was perfect. And I got to go out to all kinds of groups of people, senior level people, people in call centers, people in service centers all over the U.S., and begin to ask them what was happening. So instead of presupposing what was happening, and the models at that point were things like Kubler-Ross's death and dying curve, and people were not actually dying. They may have felt like they were dying. If you lost your job in Lawton, Oklahoma, and you'd been there 20 years, you may have experienced some, that kind of level of loss. But basically, what started happening as we kept asking the question and asking the question, just like I did with you all, a pattern began to emerge. And what we saw was that there were some clumps or clusters of experience. And from that, we began to create this change curve to help both pattern and predict and give people a sense of what they would go through as they experience change. So what I'm going to do is show you the transition curve model and help you understand break it down and look at the behaviors in each phase. And since that time with AT&T, we've used this in multiple organizational transitions, mergers, reorgs, even startups going to the next phase. Because even a change that you choose has disruption. So what I want to do is describe a little bit and why your experiences were a little all over the place. If we had asked you for the people who initiated the change, you would have a very different experience of this curve than people who got changed on, or as one person said, voluntold to do this. Because what happens in this first phase of denial, and let me make also a note here that we found that instead of calling it denial, which implies that it's fixed, that it was denying. And putting ing on the back of each of these phases help people understand that you could be denying, but then it also implies that you will be changing to resisting and going from resisting to exploring and from exploring to committing. So it's not a fixed state. And sometimes you can be denying at 9 a.m. and by 2 you're exploring. It just depends upon the magnitude. And the other thing that we found is the greater the disruption, or using what we learned in the earlier part of this, the greater the social or physical threat, the scarf that was invoked, the longer it took people to kind of go through that resisting, recalibration, getting their brain to stop hurting with the new change. So what I want to do is describe some of the experiences that people had, and I'm going to do it in a way that allows us to look at the behaviors, not necessarily because what I found is that what people say and what they do, or what they feel and what they do, may be very different. So what I want to do is take us to the next and talk about behaviors that happen in denying. And let me also say that even if you go through a change that you chose, let's say you got the new house that you always wanted, or you had a baby, or you got married, because denying is very helpful state to be in. It's a very good place to begin a change because it minimizes, helps you minimize all the planning you have to do to get your marriage, your wedding to happen, or all the packing and unpacking and restructuring you have to do to get your brand new house to feel like home. So what happens in denying is it's actually very common that people don't want to talk about it. They just want to get going. Or they say, this is going to be no big deal. Or I don't want to, you know, I don't want to have to start working at this. Nothing's really happening. And for many organizations and people, people will keep up with the work that they're doing because it's familiar. And they don't want to understand or start thinking of all the changes that they're going to have to make. So denying is very real, it's predictable, and it's actually very serving. It's very helpful to have denying going on. It's where all big ideas start, and especially with entrepreneurs. They you know, no big deal, I can start this company. So, but actually the thing that is very clear with the second phase in resisting, and kind of the resisting is just the word for helping the brain make new patterns and get comfortable. And it's also about dealing with loss. Because as you see here in this cartoon, even the butterfly may still feel like a caterpillar. And just because you have moved on doesn't mean that you're comfortable yet. So in the second phase of change, in the I'm sorry, I went to the wrong way. Oops, now we're really going backwards. What is very predictable and under anger is always loss. People are grumpy because they are discombobulated. They feel they cannot, you know, figure out the new interface of the upgraded whatever it is. You know, they want to just go back and click where their hand knows how to go. So you'll find people grumpy because all of their patterns have been broken and disrupted. My favorite thing is if you really want to change an organization, change the strategy, and this is what people do, and I'm saying this in a tongue-in-cheek way, do not do this. Don't change the strategy. Reorg everybody, change the parking lot, the cafeteria, and the way people come to work and where they park. And expect them not to be angry because they're dealing with too much loss. And people will complain and blame and, you know, just kind of check out. And again, a lot of you said exhausted, overwhelmed, you know, I just can't take one more meeting. You know, I've just recently been going from 2 calendars to 1 calendar. Drives me crazy. I am grumpy. And so sometimes in the resisting phase, your brain is just trying to make new patterns. So in the next stage, and this is that 51% of the way, you'll notice at the bottom of the curve where the blue just starts to show up. People actually, with the AT&T people, it was very interesting to get them to talk about how they knew things were getting better. And they said things like, I stopped crying when I pulled into the parking lot, or I started singing again when I got in the shower, or for some people, they started eating again, or for some people, they stopped eating, and they stopped eating everything. And so what happens is you'll know, if you can understand when you can, what your sign of getting into this 51% and more, then you will know that you have moved from that kind of bottom of the curve. And you'll find yourself looking at new things, looking at options. I use the example of a divorce. You know, when you get over kind of feeling the loss, this is the phase when people want to date everyone. They are into exploring and lots of ideas, and they can't stay focused. So what happens at this phase, you can expect people to be all over the place. And at the end, when we reach the committing, people have regained kind of the sense of control or pattern, that people feel comfortable again, you know, and they still may feel a loss, but they've been able to understand it a little better. They've got some new patterns. They can look back, and for many people, they're ready to look at the next change. Let me tell you a quick story about a man I met on an airplane, and this is why I don't talk about my work a lot, because you get strapped in with somebody and you have to be there for 2 hours. And I said, oh, I work in the change field. And he goes, oh, change. Let me tell you about change. He said, the first time I got laid off, he said, I just, true denial. He'd gone in his car to the door of the workplace, and he said, I got in my car and I went back to work. And what happened for him is that he could not get in. He didn't have his badge, and it was over. But he couldn't deal with that because his body, his autonomic system, his car driving system took him to work. He said once he got to the door and couldn't get in, he sort of woke up and said, ugh, and entered the second stage of resisting and experiencing the loss. And he said he drove straight to the little convenience store, and he bought lots of beer, lots of candy bars, and rented lots of movies, and he just went home and laid on his couch. And he did that for a number of weeks because it really was hard for him to process and experience the kind of loss that he was having. And then his wife kind of said, yeah, it's time to, get up off the couch and go get a job. So he started exploring, found another job, and was committed. He said the second time this happened to him, now this maybe he's just in a turbulent industry, maybe he doesn't get what's going on, but he said the second time, he said, I didn't drive back to the company. I went straight to the convenience store. I got the beer, the candy bars, the movies. He says, I've got my change process down to 2 days now. So what you're seeing is that you can, once you experience or kind of open up the plasticity of change, you can get better at it. Doesn't mean it doesn't affect you and startle you, but you could get better. So we're going to talk later on about resilience. What I want to do now is show you what we call the zigzag, and this is basically letting you know that you will go back and forth. You'll go from denying to resisting to back to denying, over to resisting, over to exploration, back and forth, back and forth. So this is a common pattern. So just understand you can be in 2 phases at once, or as I say, you can actually go through all these phases at the beginning of a meeting. You can't believe what your boss is saying. Then you say, this is stupid, I can't stand this. That's the resisting. Then you begin to think of an option. And then you say, I could do this. So you can go through all 4 phases of the change curve in a short amount of time. What I want to do is show you where people and organizations get stuck. And there's a very powerful disconnect that happens because in the workplace, people often do not want to deal with the bottom 2 phases of change. They don't want to deal with the loss or the upset and the messiness of exploration. They really wish people would just get over it and get on with it. And I can't tell you how many senior teams that I've worked on with this, because what happens is they have been planning the change. They announce it to the organization. They can't understand why everybody doesn't just embrace it immediately, because they've had a lot of time to deal with the transition, and they are just releasing it onto people for the first time. What happens is they will ask you to be committed. People will raise their hands, smile discreetly, and say yes, yes, and then fall back into resisting. So there's nothing more upsetting for a leader to kind of think they're over it and come back to the meeting and have everybody still griping and upset. So what happens is this Tarzaning takes you more time, because what you're doing is you're pretending you're over in commitment, and you have to go backwards and go back and let people talk about why the loss and the upset, and kind of as we talked about earlier, let their brains make sense of it. So it's very common to have the leaders ahead of the organization. And what I want to do is give you some ways of helping yourself through this. And basically, I will say that the biggest points are notice when you're denying. And remember that it's predictable, normal, and a good place to start, especially a really big change. And then feel your resistance. Feel upset, go home to the couch, take a walk outside, say, this is not easy. I'm going to just be grumpy for a while. And then begin to either team up with somebody or say, what is the little piece of something that I could be able to do? What is something that I can start using to help myself? And then act on things you can control. And just move on and keep going with what you can do to help the change work for you. So I want to go through a little bit, and this is a fairly easy piece on what you can do with teams, because basically as you're leading teams, first you lead yourself, so we just talked about that. And what you do for a team is you go back in the beginning of a change, instead of just, it's important to announce it, but also talk about the future. They won't be listening to you, remember, because they're in denial. But you want them to wake up. So the sooner you can wake them up, the better. The sooner you can say, we are moving our operations. We are closing the 4-inch wafer fabs. We are doing this. We are doing that. Wake people up. Don't leave them in denial. And then when they're in this second phase is gather them together and help them talk about what they're losing. And help them give it names. Remember back in the scarf, you can control the limbic system by saying, this is really hard. This is disruptive. Let people tell you what they're going through. They will have words for it, and you don't have to fix it. And remember that your brain is trying to establish a new pattern. So expect people to be grumpy and messy. And I always called it wearing the tomato suit. I used to have a red suit that I would wear to these big meetings where everyone was going to complain miserably. And just understand that you want them to complain, because it's better than pretending that they're committed with the person with the smile but is not really smiling, and moving themselves forward. So it's okay to let them be upset at you. So that's what, throwing the tomatoes at you is what I called it, because in some ways you're the authority that they can express this to. And the more complainable you are, the faster your people will move. So when you're leading people through exploring, just remember to help them focus. They are so all over the place. They've got lots of good ideas. They want to do things, and help them say, we can do these 3 things. We can't do these 12 things. Let's keep ourselves focused. So helping them get some early wins and success. And this is the place to provide training. Do not train people when they're in denying or when they're in resisting, because they won't come to the training because they will forget about it, and in resisting they won't learn anything because they are so upset. Save your training budget for this phase. Okay, and now, excuse me, hang on, okay, and when they're through, so as a way of summarizing, sorry, we're getting ahead of it. So basically, wake people up, listen to them, help them focus, and get them moving. Get them focused and thank them. The other part about committing is to really thank them and acknowledge what they've been through. It helps them go to the next change with more engagement. So when you're choosing where to start, with the change, some of you will think, well, maybe I should go to the denying people first. I don't recommend that. I recommend you go over here to the people who are exploring, gain support from some of the early adopters, then come back and use their support to wake up and make people aware in that denying stage. And then help people and help their brains make sense in the third stage, in the resisting. So again, to summarize, do training when they are in exploring. You'll save yourself a lot of strain and a lot of a lot of money in training and retraining. So let's go to the fourth section and look at resilience and kind of look at how do you make yourself change hardy. I'd like you to, as we did before, know that you already have this experience in your life experience. So I'm going to ask you to think back to a time in your life when you were doing really well, when you were doing something that really worked for you. It could be a job, it could be something in your personal life. Again, I'm not going to ask you to share this. There's not going to be any polling on this. So just get in mind this time when things were going really well. And what I'm going to do is ask you some questions about it, and we'll build a model of resilience from your answers. So as you thought of that time when things were really well, when you were at your peak performance, did things make sense? Were you able to understand why things were happening? Were you able to go beyond your limits? Could you stretch yourself? Did you go where you thought you couldn't go? And did you take direct action? Were you able to do something that you could control? And did someone thank you or acknowledge you? Did someone call you out? Did someone notice you? And I'm asking you these questions because there's two pieces of research that I relied on very early that have continued to actually be demonstrated over and over again in terms of being able to create this hardiness or resilience. And let me explain them. The first three elements, coherence, challenge, and control, come from a research study that was done actually at AT&T during the divestiture. And they were able to do retrospective chart or health records review. And they looked at who got sick and who stayed healthy. And they actually found that these three elements distinguished between the two populations. The first, coherence, and this is also found with survivors of fairly difficult conditions, prisoner of war camp survivors, very difficult physical challenges, that if it makes sense why it's happening, if you have a kind of understanding of why we need to do this, then you will do better. The challenge piece has to do with being stretched by yourself instead of pulled, finding ways to go just 1% more, what we call nano practices, little bits of change that can be added up. It actually, think of it as it makes you more limber. You take 1% plus 1% plus 1% times 100 equals 100% change. So you just challenge yourself and you don't make yourself go all the way. And then the third element has to do with choice, involvement, and participation. Giving people control, even if it's a small thing, even if it's a little bit. I actually find that people do much better when given a choice. If you have to reorganize and move, or you have to take up, do you want to learn this today or tomorrow? Do you want to learn this in the morning or the afternoon? Giving people even a tiny choice makes them much more resilient. Now the last one, the connection, and I've just put it into these 4 C's so it's easy to remember, is from another piece of research that has to do with emotional support, and it's a longitudinal study being run in Alameda County in the San Francisco Bay Area, and they're basically looking at longevity. And the one thing that really was called out in the results as they're cumulatively stacking up is that people with more connections live longer. They are hardier. And it's very interesting to kind of look at the differences between genders, because if you ask women how many friends they have or how many connections they have, they will just kind of keep ticking off the number of friends they have. But if you ask men how many friends they have, they often kind of look at you quizzically and say, well, my spouse, or sometimes they say their dog. Because by and large, men have much fewer emotional relationships. They may have buddies, but this is about emotional expression. So people with more sense of community and expression have much more hardiness. And this can be used when you think about how to buffer both yourself or your team or your organization during change. So let me kind of go over in terms of, for a person, if you can understand why the change is happening and what's the bigger picture. Some of you noted the bigger picture. That really helps you. If you can break down the change into little pieces, I'm going to pack one box. I'm going to, clear out one file or one piece of, part of my desk. And the control is, again, about participating. Everybody is going to pack boxes today, and we're going to, have snacks, or we're going to have a potluck, and we're going to clean up the office, and we're going to do it with our friends. We're going to talk about how hard this is, and we're going to do it anyway. So you can also use these things in working with teams and groups. What I want to do as a way of kind of bringing us to the end of this section, so we have plenty of time for questions, is to talk a little bit about increasing employee involvement, because I actually find that people are very self-managing, and that sometimes you can do things, again, to reduce the scarf. Meeting with people, I don't know why this is not showing up here, Sarah. There was something, let's see. There it is, it's coming up, I see. Basically, it helps to get people together and talk about the big picture of why the change is happening. Again, people need to know the strategy. They don't need to know all the pieces of it, but they deserve the big picture, and it helps people to adjust their brains. The other thing that's helpful is for the leader to keep talking about the goals and the vision, or for you to keep talking about your goal and your vision, so that you can remind yourself of where you're going. And it actually, again, with that part about reducing the threat, you're naming it. You're saying, this is why they don't tell you when you go to school all the things you're going to do, because it would overwhelm you. They break it down into teeny parts. This semester, this course, this module, this piece, this test, they break it down so that people can maintain their lofty, vision and goal, but keep moving forward. There's also the part of helping people discuss fears and concerns. And if you want them to discuss fears and concerns, you better start with yourself as a leader. And we call this emotional literacy. This is one of the core components of the leadership course that I teach at Presidio, is helping the leader step first, because they will follow your lead. If you can say, this is hard for you, it is not losing power. It is not making yourself an awkward leader. It is basically saying, I understand what you're experiencing, and I will go there with you. And these open forums, these should not be griping sessions, but they're ways for people to develop a pattern of what is upsetting them and then name it. Again, because that calms your brain down. It allows people to get information, and in some cases, the leader, I also recommend that you do this in as large a group as you can, because when you do this with one person at a time, let's say you have 50 people in your team, you're going to have to do this 50 times, or spend 2 really good hours kind of digging into their concerns with everybody online or in the same room. So I recommend it, holding the largest groups you can. People need to be reminded how far they've come and what's the next thing, and how they can begin to see their own progress. And the ritual part is very interesting because I think it's very important for people to know some things are going to keep going. We are still going to have the Friday afternoon, pizza party, or, we're still going to be able to do this. A ritual is actually just a way for people to acknowledge loss and name what's going on and give each other support to keep going. And the last one is let people choose. Let them choose where to start. It doesn't say whether they have the choice to do it or not, but do you want to do it this day or this day? Let them set the day when they think they can be done with the migration or the adaptation that they're going through. So what I've tried to do is give you some of what I've learned over the past 25 or so years. I'd like to open it up for questions and be able to spend the last about 4 minutes answering as many questions as I can, and we'll take the rest of them offline. So how do I open up the questions?
Okay, great. I'll read them out so that everyone can hear them on the line. You have them there, Cynthia, in your questions detail. Just scroll down to the bottom of your box. You should be able to see them there. We're going to start here with one of the first questions that came in early on. It's from Robert. And Cynthia, the question is, what is the hardest part for change leaders?
I think the hardest part for change leaders is that they get very frustrated with people for not changing fast enough. And what they don't understand is that they have been contemplating making coherence, making sense, readjusting their brains, and then they spring it on other people and expect them to adapt immediately. And so they get frustrated and they go, why can't these people get it? And so I think it's closing that gap and having compassion. And the way to do that is let them in on it sooner and let them know what you're thinking. I'm not seeing the questions, so I'm trying to see them.
They should be all the way at the bottom of your questions box.
In the chat? In the chat?
Not in the chat box, in the questions. There'll be questions for you.
I'm expanding it, but there's
exactly where you saw the other chat ends, and then scroll down, and they'll be at the bottom.
Okay, keep reading them, and let's just keep going.
Sure, sure. So we have a couple others that certainly here have come in. A couple I'm going to summarize here as they're on kind of concepts. But this one here is from Jai, and the question is, do you support the idea that most people don't do well with too many options when facing change?
Yes, your brain is overwhelmed. And as David Rock likes to say, the stage is full. Reduce options, but again, leave options. It's like if you take your kid to a 31 flavors store, they can't decide what flavor, but say you can have chocolate, strawberry, or almond. Let them reduce the amount of choices. It reduces the strain on the brain.
Great. Julie asks, how do you know what phase everyone is in, especially when you're dealing with 15,000 resources across the globe?
just imagine that they're everywhere. And again, I would set up your meeting so you start with the people over in exploring and say, we've had a lot of new ideas. Let's go back and talk about how we have to wake up to these ideas, and then go to the third, resisting. So I would use that kind of pattern. Imagine that you'll get, it's almost like if you had a polling or a way to do a sensing, the curve would move slowly, and there will always be some early adopters. But just imagine that you have to kind of do that 1, 2, 3 each time. And go to, start out with some enthusiasm. You can say, what's working? Who's got somebody that's, started to adapt to this? Because what that does is allow the group to provoke the people who are still snoozing to wake up.
Great, great. Thank you so much, Cynthia. Keep sending in your questions. We have run out of time for today, but Cynthia will be reviewing all of your questions, and we will send that out to you. You'll get that in email form, and anyone who has really thorough questions, things like that, will reach out to you by phone as well to discuss those. So feel free, continue to send those in. Cynthia, if you wouldn't mind moving to our last slide so
Absolutely.
that we can give them some information on the Mastering the Change Curve. Now, the assessment here that the foundation of what Cynthia's been talking about today is Mastering the Change Curve, written by Cynthia and Jaffe, and it's regularly the facilitator material is $128. We've got a special for you today. It's only $25, and you'll get the full workshop instructions for a classroom session. You'll get a copy of the online and paper assessments so you can review through those, the theoretical background. There is a PowerPoint presentation that goes with the classroom session, and we have that available for a 30-day return policy. It's a great piece, and so you can take a look at that risk-free. Any additional questions that come in, we will get those back out to you with answers. And we do really appreciate your time today, and we look forward to connecting with you further on this topic.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Wonderful to work with all of you today.